Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War news update, geopolitical news, one I hadn't done for a couple of days. So much has been going on, all this breaking news, Dutch government collapsing, Kerch Bridge being attacked, air bases being attacked, lives discussing all this, and in amongst all of these activities and these events is, you know, what's been going on in the background of the war in Ukraine, and a lot of very important announcements, I guess, concerning the war. So, you know, let's get on with that. We'll start with OPEC Plus, and we have seen OPEC Plus previously ramp up supply of oil for reasons that one might think have to do with potentially attacking the United States, maybe fracking oil sector, because that's quite expensive to extract. And if you flood the market with oil, then it makes oil very cheap, and then it disincentivizes you to drill more because that's expensive. You need to make sure you're getting as much return on investment, so high oil prices, and it disincentivizes, you know, fracking oil extraction as well. So that could be one of the reasons. OPEC Plus is essentially a cartel trying to manipulate prices that are strategically beneficial for them or economically beneficial. So they have done this a couple of times previously, and they're doing it again and want to continue doing it. And that hurts Russia, because the more oil on the market, the lower the price. The lower the price, the more it hurts Russia, because actually they have fairly high extraction costs. They're not getting support from international entities helping them in this sector anymore, as they are sanctioned, and they need as much money as they can to prosecute the war. So extending the oil output surge, OPEC Plus is continuing that despite Russian pushback. According to Bloomberg, OPEC Plus will boost oil production by 411,000 barrels per day in July, marking the third consecutive monthly increase and reinforcing a major strategic shift that has driven crude prices to a 4-year low. Good news for the international community in terms of, one, inflation, and two, hurting Russia. This will hurt Russia. NATO and Russia are to hold simultaneous Baltic Sea drills, raising the risks of incidents, says the Bild, a German tabloid newspaper. NATO's annual Baltops exercise is scheduled to begin in early June, as per usual, while Russia has moved up its own naval drills by a month, deploying around 20 warships. My goodness, some serious war games going on there potentially. Sweden is to tighten control, speaking of the Baltic Sea, control over Russia's shadow fleet in the Baltic Sea. So starting on July the 1st, the Swedish Coast Guard and the Maritime Administration will be able to access insurance data for all vessels transiting Swedish waters, not just those docking in ports. It's very important. So they can see a ship going through the waters to international waters or to somewhere else, and they can access the insurance details. And if they are found unsuitable, inadequate, then I presume they can stop that ship, rather than having to wait until it docks in a Swedish port. Excellent news. So ships, I presume, going from St. Petersburg, passing through Swedish waters, are either going to have to take a different route or run the gauntlet if they don't have the required papers. That's good news. Tightening the grip on, or tightening the regulation around those shadow fleet vessels. But yeah, now staying on Sweden, a prestigious music competition in Stockholm has been secretly channeling entry fees to a sanctioned Russian bank while employing jury members from institutions that support the war in Ukraine, a Swedish media investigation reveals. Someone on my thread the other day was saying that Swedish media still calls Ukrainian city names by the Russian transcription, and yeah, there is, I guess, an element of support for Russia in some implicit ways in Sweden. I don't know enough about what's going on in Sweden. It might well just be a leftover cultural thing, or it could be that there is genuine support from some small areas of Sweden, I don't know. Sweden has been very supportive of Ukraine, of course, as have Norway and Finland. Really, really strong support from all the Nordic nations. Denmark, let's not forget them too. But anyway, here we have an opportunity for someone to funnel some money to Russia through a music festival there. Chancellor Merz from Germany is going to meet President Trump this Thursday, it appears, in Washington. Now, that is going to be a really important meeting. How's he going to play that one, Merz? How's he going to discuss Ukraine? I presume that will come up. How is he going to deal with a White House ambush that may well happen? Are they going to be championing AFD to his face? I don't know. Lots of questions. We'll see how that goes. In fact, as Tendar says, we will see what this will yield. But as somebody recently said, calibrate your enthusiasm. I certainly will. Yes. Now, top EU diplomat Kaja Kallas has said recently that the US criticism of Europe shows love nonetheless. Europe's top diplomat welcomed the criticism from Washington as a sign of continued American engagement during defence talks in Singapore. Now, these defence talks, as I mentioned previously, have been quite important. Emmanuel Macron supposedly gave the speech of his life there, which is pretty welcome to hear. Support for Ukraine, support for European resilience and unity. Here at the Singapore Defence Forum, Pete Hegseth pointed out to Europe's recent increases in military spending as a benchmark, urging Asian allies to match or exceed these efforts in light of the escalating threat from China. He reportedly argued that it is inconsistent for European nations to invest so heavily in defence, while Asian allies facing a more immediate threat lag behind in their own military expenditures. Goodness me, it was only a few months ago that all the criticism was aimed at Europe for not spending enough. And as soon as, a few months pass, it's now, right, okay, you're not spending enough, Asia, you're not spending enough. Goodness me. Anyway, it's love nonetheless, so it's better than no love, Kallas told reporters when asked about Hegseth's criticism of Europe's defence investment. So, I guess it's a case of trying to sell US criticism in a way that or respond to US criticism in a way that really placates the US without, I guess, saying too much. Kallas described Hegseth's remarks as positive, despite their critical tone. You heard his speech. He was actually quite positive about Europe, so there's definitely some love there. Hegseth told the conference delegates that the US was pushing our allies in Europe to own more of their own security, to invest in their defence. Thanks to President Trump, they are stepping up. He praised Poland and the Baltic states as model allies. But remember, as I've told you before, the more the US pushed Europe away, the less the US will be able to influence strategic decisions, and the less Europe will be buying from the United States. It's that simple. There is a return on investment that the US get by being the head honchos, essentially, and for having so much, has so many troops and so much resource investment and, I guess, monetary investment in Europe. It's not. You don't do it for shits and giggles, right? These things bring about an advantage to the US, and you can argue very convincingly that they should take a step back and Europe should step up, but just be aware that it will come at a cost to the US if Europe does step up, which they are doing. It depends from whose point of view you want to look at. For Europe's point of view, you might be like, yeah, we need the US on side, but just not dictating everything and actually pushing the US away, or being pushed away by the US and told to stand on their own 2 feet, is bringing Europe a sense of independence and also economic stimulus from the military industrial complex point of view. Kallas acknowledged divisions in Europe over military spending levels. Some of us have realised a long time ago that we need to invest in defence, she said. So anyway, that's that. Moving on, we have, sorry, it's rendering. Trump's advisor admits NATO is waging a proxy war against Russia. So we're going from Hegseth now to Keith Kellogg. And Keith Kellogg is saying all sorts of stuff at the moment, and quite a few of the things he says I massively disagree with right now. This is him recently on Fox News.
The fact that Chancellor Merz has said, well, I'm going to give the Ukrainians the Taurus missile system. Well, that's like a Tomahawk land attack missile in miniature form. It's got a significant warhead to it. It travels, roughly 300 miles, which means you can penetrate deep into Russian space. Putin has made those comments. Well, if you're going to supply them with weapons, we continue to be part of the aggressor. And he considers this a proxy war by NATO as well right now. And frankly, in a way it is. I mean, you look at what the European nations have done with support. I mean, it's clearly Putin sees that. The fact that...
So this is interesting because it depends how you interpret this. I wrote an article at the beginning of the war for Only Sky. Unfortunately, they no longer exist, so all my articles are at the moment archived and ready to go on a new website soon. But I wrote an article saying this is a proxy war. But when I write it, like, words are important, and it was a very nuanced article, and it wasn't a proxy war in the sense that it's a pejorative term, or that Europe or NATO or the US had forced Ukraine into a war and were using Ukraine to fight against Russia, but that Ukraine was fighting against Russia, and let's say NATO as a collective term there, NATO is supplying Ukraine with loads of weapons and everything other than, so money, weapons, training, intel, everything. There's an economic war, there is an information war, there is a cyber war going alongside this. Ukraine is fighting on behalf of NATO, and in that sense, I would agree it's a proxy war, but not in a way that Putin would say. And so if Kellogg is going to agree with Putin here, then that's a problem, because he is regurgitating Russian talking points, which is this idea that NATO, the US, Europe went into Ukraine in 2014, and Euromaidan protests were all about the manipulation of these nefarious entities, and then they're wanting NATO expansionism, they're forcing Ukraine into this war against Russia, and it's actually NATO's war against Russia. No, that's not my position. When I talk about it being a proxy war, is not that, but that's what Putin would mean, because then it's blaming the war on NATO rather than accepting responsibility from a Russian point of view for invading Ukraine, as well they should. They invaded Ukraine. They have the moral culpability there. So Kellogg here is being deeply unhelpful by saying, and frankly, he's got a point. They are fighting a proxy war. Unless you're going to be really careful about explaining yourself and qualifying those statements, as I've just done from my point of view, then, don't say things like that. Okay. So then we have Mike Pompeo. Fascinating. So the former US Secretary of State, this is not a pawn that can be sacrificed. The US will not abandon Ukraine in the fight against Russia, he said at the Black Sea Security Forum that just took place in Odessa. Ukraine is just one of Putin's goals. He won't stop there. The US did not do enough to stop the war in 2014. So Mike Pompeo is coming out and saying broadly the right things. What I'd like to hear him say is a huge public criticism of Trump and saying, we need to move back to doing X, Y, and Z. We don't quite hear that, but he is saying at least that the US will not abandon Ukraine. But are they just empty words? Will the US actually abandon Ukraine? Well, I guess it's going to depend an awful lot on what Congress does and whether they can stand up to Trump in supporting the bill from Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal. Now, Trump is to retain US role in NATO command, according to Reuters. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So this is exactly the discussion I was just having with you, which is the more the US pushes Europe away and asks it to become independent, the less the US is able to influence the conversation and the decisions and the strategy. And of course, the US wants to be top dog, right? and it wants to be in control of NATO and have NATO do what it wants it to do, rather than NATO be a collective of all of these nations, and the European nations having just as much say as the US, and then the US having to actually do certain things that the European nations want, rather than it just being this plaything of the United States. So there's been this move by the Trump administration to pull troops out of Europe, American NATO troops out of Europe. And then there's been this potential for the US to give up their command role in the European NATO command. At the moment, there's General Cavalli there, who I think is in that position. Now, if they did that, that would be true isolationism. And it appears that Trump realizes that that could be a step too far, because actually then the US get no say in NATO, or not enough say in NATO. And here's that push and shove. They're you know, everyone's looking for some kind of optimal position, but it's compromise. You know, if you want the Europeans to pay more, to provide more capability and capacity, to do more, then you will pay less. Yep, that's what you want. Provide less. Yeah, maybe that's what you want as well. And do less, and therefore be in command less. So Trump has personally informed Mark Rutte of the decision to appoint an American general as NATO commander in Europe. Trump made it clear that Washington is not yet going to completely withdraw from participation in European security issues. Well, who knew? That's the nub of it, of course. And it will get to a point where you're like, well, if you want to keep controlling stuff, you need to have the controlling amount of troops and money spent here, right? So otherwise, you know, you will have to have European commanders who are commanding over American resources, right? And you might not like that, but that's the way it happens the other way around, okay? Right, so Hungary and Slovakia knowingly stay dependent on Russian energy. A study has shown, a detailed report has found that the two countries ignoring viable options to reduce the reliance on Russian gas, the two countries are, and that they being Hungary and Slovakia, and also that includes nuclear supply. So they are ignoring other alternatives on purpose, knowingly staying dependent on Russian hydrocarbons, which keeps in the Russian sphere of influence. And of course, there will be a quid pro quo, absolutely. This is a huge issue because Europe is trying to wean itself off hydrocarbons. In fact, I just saw a chart that I'm going to find for you. Okay, so here it is. This is the chart. So we talk about how Europe is still using Russian hydrocarbons, but again, there's going to be a lot to do with Hungary and Slovakia in there. They are weaning themselves off, and this is an interesting chart to see. Gazprom's sales, so this is gas sales to EU, continue to decline, now down 93% from February 2022. So these green bars in this histogram are from 2022. And obviously show you very high demand there. Then straight after February, things declined quite rapidly, all things considered, down to this kind of pretty low amount here, and actually then went up in 2023, more towards sort of July 2023. And then in 2024, more so. And then there's been this concerted effort to get it back down. And now there's a formal plan to wean the EU off hydrocarbons, so gas being included here. So then when you look at these grey bars here, this is 2025, and you have a real cut from last year to the lowest yet, and that is going down. So yes, Russia is still taking money from Europe, but it is less than it was, and here I think is a good indication of that. But these things are complicated, and of course then you've got atomic sales and oil sales as well. Now I just want to talk about Hungary and Slovakia. Poland obviously just had their presidential elections. It's interesting to see, and I think this is probably a result of social media playing a part, farming issues playing a part. and probably social cohesion issues too and stuff. Lots of Ukrainians over in Poland may be feeding into this, but Poland's sympathy for Ukrainians, it has definitely gone down. So in 2023, 51% of Poles sympathized with the Ukrainians, 17% didn't, and everyone else in the middle. That then moved to 40% sympathized, 30% didn't in 2024. And now in 2025, 30% sympathize with Ukrainians and 38% don't, which means that more Poles do not sympathize with Ukrainians than do. And as this person says, thanks to the Russian bots and the Polish right wing, even not only the far right, so this person's accusing the general right wing in Poland of facilitating this kind of movement. In 2022, 20 to 30% had heard something about Volyn. So Volyn was a massacre that took place at the end of the 1943 was it? That has been this bone of contention between the two nations. Then you had the request from Poland to Zelenskyy to exhume bodies, and then Zelenskyy had agreed to that. Was it the end of last year? It has been agreed to try and smooth things over. But in 2025, now 80% of people have heard of that in Poland. So that's become this much greater, much better known thing. But of course, that thing is divisive. It's just a really divisive, uncomfortable part of their joint history there. This person says the main reasons, this is Matrona Cherkes, are social and economic. The myth that Ukrainians are taking over jobs, though the unemployment is very low and there's tons of work. A real issue, the raise of rent costs, that's a real issue. And a real issue, Poles are facing completion for the first time. Previously, they went to the West to be competition. Many of the refugees come from big cities, educated middle class. So this is really interesting. In the UK, when we were part of the EU, there was a lot of pushback about Polish people coming over here, taking our jobs. Honestly, the Poles were seen as a bit of a threat. We had plumbers and builders, and we're like, Polish, they're coming over, they're doing things more cheaply. If you're working in those trades, if you were a consumer, you're like, excellent, nice, really reasonable price on the plumbing this Pole is doing. But then you had this very real situation where a lot of people were coming over working in the fields in, say, Lincolnshire. So Lincolnshire is this county in the UK where actually Reform UK have done very, very well. Why? Because they had a lot of Eastern European immigration. Why? My sister was just there taking a week away in her little camper van, right? And she sent a picture she put pictures on Facebook saying, I can't believe how many agricultural fields are on Lincolnshire. It's just huge freaking farmlands everywhere. I was like, yeah. And we refused to work on them. And so Lincolnshire had huge communities of Eastern Europeans, and that's why Reform UK are, Boston and Lincoln, these places, Reform or UKIP at the time did really, really well because there was that pushback due to an influx of foreign Eastern European workers. But why? Because we weren't prepared to do the jobs. Well, someone's got to do those jobs. So you had these kind of minimum wage workers coming over. Now, the point of me saying all that is that those Poles often were people who were well overqualified to do those jobs. So kind of your middle class, like professionals coming over and, coming to try and get a foot in the UK, trying to get social mobility. But they were well overqualified for working on the fields, but there they were working on the fields. Right. Then, so it's just the irony here, or not, I don't know if irony is the right word, but it's just that the analog here is that there's a real issue. Poles are facing competition for the first time. So Ukrainians are coming to Poland, possibly, and then competing in these sectors where people are like, oh, we can get a cheaper Ukrainian person to do this job, or just that there is competition in those sectors. And then you have resentment from the Poles saying, damn, these Ukrainians are coming over and they're taking our jobs. previously they went to the West to be competitors. So previously the Poles went to places like the UK to be the competition, and now they're feeling the competition from another nation. Interestingly, as a lot of Poles have gone back to Poland from the UK. Many of the refugees come from big cities. They're educated and middle class. Exactly what I was saying. So we have people working on the fields in the UK who were educated middle class from the cities, coming over to get that social mobility, seeing the UK as a way to improve their life, coming over from what was a poorer setup in Poland. Now Poland has become this economic success on the back of the EU. They are now complaining about Ukrainians coming to their nation and taking all the jobs. But I'm hopefully just trying to join dots for you here and give my experience of this from a UK point of view. Another option here, or another theory, is jealousy. Given that there are many people of the middle classes, they started opening businesses, got good jobs, buying property which low-class Poles couldn't afford. And if they come from Germany or the Netherlands, there wouldn't have been that frustration. But these people come from Ukraine, and they look down, they're looked down upon at best and detested at worst. So there's a resentment of people coming from Ukraine to get these jobs rather than someone come from Germany. Exactly the same in the UK, right? So at the height of Brexit issues, we were complaining about Eastern Europeans because we looked down on Poland and Romania and these Eastern European nations. But if we had French and German people coming over, Danish people coming over to get jobs in London or wherever, we'd be like, hey, it's no problem. We'll let the French and the Germans and the Danish. Yeah, there, because we didn't look down on them in the same way that we looked down. I'm not saying justifiably so, by the way, but we looked down on the Eastern Europeans, and the Eastern Europeans now, so Poland here. So this person says there's a sense of looking down on their Eastern European neighbours in Ukraine. So I find this fascinating. So yeah, if they came from Germany or the Netherlands, there wouldn't have been this frustration. But these people came from Ukraine. They looked down on at best and detested at worst. There's this myth that most men came illegally. Stats say the opposite. Of course, Ukrainian women steal Polish men. So there is, all of these real common either tropes or real issues or myths. And of course, there is a myth about criminality. Basically, 90% we heard about the Poles during the Brexit, and 60% of what we hear about immigration in general, all said by the Polish experts and demographists. About stealing Polish men, it's a myth, of course, too. The organisation fighting against xenophobia and racism, Never Again, in translation, gets calls from Ukrainians every day. That doesn't mean that each Ukrainian is discriminated and most have good experiences, but there is that. And then you get Russian propaganda thrown in as well. The great substitution theory in Poland, so the great replacement theory, the idea that in America or many countries that these brown-skinned people are coming over here and they're taking over and they're actually being imported by one political party so that they get more votes, blah blah blah, and all this kind of nonsense is a myth. There's that idea that can be perpetuated in Poland from nefarious sources and whatnot. So all of those really interesting ideas that all feeding into I'd say growing lack of, I don't know that that's the right way of saying it, a decreasing sympathy for Ukrainians in Poland. And then you put that together with the recent Polish presidential win, and that may have played a part as well. Who knows? Right, okay. So Zelenskyy here met with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, thanking the alliance for the strong support. This is when he was in Vilnius meeting with was it B9, nations? I think this was in Vilnius. He shared updates on prisoner exchanges and child returns from Istanbul talks. And Russia's refusal of unconditional ceasefire. Only increased pressure can change this. Discussed next diplomatic steps, defense aid and boosting Ukraine's long-range capabilities. So that's Zelenskyy. I love these Zelenskyy meetings. I love it when he is, which is often the case, much shorter than other leaders because he's a short man. And always just, I don't know, there's something amusing about little and large. But I'm always, my heart is always warmed by the warmth of the embraces he has with other people. People like him. And you're going to be embodying the Ukrainian experience, aren't you? When you meet someone like Zelenskyy or Ukrainian people, you're automatically going to be like feeling for them, and that comes out in, I think, these kind of meetings. But I think it's always good to see the warmth with which he is met and treated. We see this so often from European leaders, and of course, we never see it from Trump and his administration, unfortunately. Here is Andrzej Duda. Now, Andrzej Duda has just not lost his position. I think he's term limited, so is now will no longer be the president of Poland. But here Zelenskyy met with him, and again, another warm embrace. So even the PIS, who are Eurosceptic, they are still firm supporters of Ukraine, even if there are some issues around the fringes and sides there. I do worry about Nawrocki coming in, because I think he's more beholden to the far right, because he was lent quite a lot of votes from them as the far right candidates dropped out, and they're definitely more pro-Russia and anti-Ukraine. But anyway, Duda here discussed bilateral relations, diplomatic efforts, and the need to maintain pressure on Russia to achieve a just peace. They also explored mutually beneficial economic projects, so that's good. And then Zelenskyy met with the Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo in Vilnius. So again, these are the 9 countries, I think, who are of that area, the Eastern European countries, who are, I think it's called the B9 or something like that. Was started maybe a decade or so ago to counteract Russian influence coming from the east. But of course, 2 of those countries, Slovakia and Hungary, are now firmly in the sphere of influence of Russia. So it's somewhat controversial. Our focus, said the president of Finland, is on investing in Ukrainian weapons production and co-manufacturing. I shared details of our drone line project, which has proven effective. We discussed how to scale it up. I guess actually that's probably President Zelenskyy, not the Prime Minister. Sorry, it's Petteri Orpo is the Prime Minister. So those are the words of Zelenskyy. And then this coming from the Vilnius summit as well, that Ukraine's NATO path is irreversible. Russia's previously demanded that Ukraine and other neighbouring countries never join NATO. And of course, we're hearing that regurgitated by the Trump administration, making a written guarantee to halt NATO's eastward expansion a key condition for ending the war. But Ukraine's NATO path being irreversible was something that was agreed upon to some degree in Vilnius there. Now, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen held an unannounced meeting after Lindsey Graham, the senator from Louisiana, and Richard Blumenthal, so you had the Republican and the Democrat, went over to Kiev, talked a really good game about support for Ukraine and putting harsh tariffs and sanctions on Russia and supporting Ukraine with more aid and whatnot. They then went back via Europe to make sure that Europe were on side with the congressional bill. And so Ursula von der Leyen met them, held this unannounced meeting, and apparently that went down pretty well, that meeting. The US has begun coordinating a new sanctions package against Russia with the EU. Said President Zelenskyy. This is a very good sign. Of course, he's talking about that congressional bill, not about the Trump administration and the government deciding that. So, it's a government in a wider sense. And it looks like all hope rests with Congress at the moment. Now, Emmanuel Macron has said, the French president, that is, North Korean soldiers in Ukraine is a big issue for all of us. Yes. Not enough is being talked about here in this regard. If China does not want NATO to be involved in Southeast Asian affairs, it must prevent North Korea from interfering in European territory. That's a good way of communicating this. Saying to China, look, mate, right, if you want NATO building up in Asia, which I'm sure you don't. We're big on European stuff. It's a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But hey, we can get Indo-Pacific on your ass if you want. Now, if you don't want that, you need to be putting pressure on North Korea not to help Russia. And in fact, you need to not be helping Russia so much yourself. So good to hear Macron say that. And I want to hear more of that. But talking about this westward expansion of NATO, it's really interesting. And Darth Putin so often, as this parody account, this real satirical account on Twitter. In fact, I think he's got a YouTube channel. Always, or so often nails it, where he's saying, Russia are complaining about eastward expansion of NATO. That, hey, NATO can't come knocking on the door of Russian neighbours. NATO can't expect Ukraine to be a part of it. But no one says anything about the western expansion of the Russian Federation. Our response should be, you're worried about NATO expansionism eastwards? You frickin' invaded a country to the west. What about actual conventional military invasion? But no, you get Keith Kellogg going, oh, we're worried about NATO expansion and, NATO proxy war, and as well, you should, they've got a point. No. Do not play into their hands. Darth Putin has nailed it there. Anyway, sorry. The EU views a Sino-Russian alliance, so you've got that's a China-Russia alliance, as the world's biggest challenge. EU leaders stress the need to defend the rules-based order amid growing China-Russia cooperation. Kaja Kallas warned that 80% of dual-use goods aiding Russia's war in Ukraine come from China. As I just said, this is an issue, and it was good to hear Emmanuel Macron talk about that, and now Kaja Kallas is saying it. I'm wondering whether there is some strategizing going on in the EU to deal with this much more formally. Now, the UK identifies Russia as an imminent and urgent threat in their strategic defence review. I did a video on this. Go and check it out. This is saying we are getting, war ready, battle ready in the UK. So I felt that was really good rhetoric coming from Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister. And also that the defence review was pretty decent. I mean, you can pick holes in it here and there, but generally speaking, it's a sensible document. We just need to find the money to implement it. But there is this recognition that Russia is an imminent and an urgent threat to the UK and our security. In particular, China will be described not as an enemy, but as a difficult challenge ready to cooperate with Moscow. So a bit, fudging the wording. Well, I suppose that is kind of correct. And that's how we should see it. So if we tar China with being an enemy too overtly, then it just pushes them even more into helping Russia. So we need to somehow see them as, you're a difficult challenge. You're maybe a competitor, but we need to work with you to stop helping them. We need to Russia needs to, I think, disintegrate, dissolve, and be remade. Make themselves, I'm not saying regime change enforced in a way that we're going to come in as the West and nation build. No, but that can't carry on. What is a dictatorship there in the way it's operating can't carry on for the good of the Russian people. So that needs to change, and we need China to help bring that about. But China is not at the moment doing that. They seem to be helping Russia more and more, possibly because the US has moved away from that, moved away from helping Ukraine. North Korea and Iran are described in the defense review as regional disruptors, whatever that may entail. I love that. Defense intelligence update. Russia sucks. Lol. Broadly speaking, yeah. So Anton Gerashenko then refers to an article by Mark Champion in Bloomberg that states that he attended a meeting of generals and officers from around 20 countries at the UK's Royal United Services Institute. So RUSI, people like Justin Bronk, Watling, and all sorts of others are involved with RUSI. They are really good, I think. But this article has some fascinating insights. So, this is a meeting of some top people here, and here's a useful breakdown of the points. So these are all quotes. Those who would have to do any fighting aren't asking if the threat of a Russian attack on a NATO member is real, but rather where, when, and in what form it comes. It's not if, it's like when and how. At the start of the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, NATO commanders were as surprised as anyone else by the ineptness of the Russian assault on Kyiv. But any complacency that followed has now gone. Rather than 5 to 10 years, as once thought, the working estimate for when Putin might have the capabilities to take on NATO once he's done in Ukraine is now multi-layered and comes from a Danish intelligence assessment earlier this year: 6 months for a localized attack, 2 years for a regional Baltic war, and 5 years for any wider European conflict. Wow. Russian forces quickly learned and adapted to Ukraine in terms of drones and electronic warfare. Russia is probably ahead of NATO. Most sobering for Western generals is the continued demonstration of Russia's near-total indifference to casualty rates. So when you're wargaming how to deal with Russia, this is the idea that and this happened with Zelenskyy in the May 2023 counteroffensive. They thought that Russia would capitulate, losing so many people, and Russia didn't. And that was a fatal mistake. If Russia don't give a damn about human beings, then wargaming outcomes becomes kind of difficult, because you can't project your own value system on the Russians, creating a latitude for Putin that NATO countries wouldn't have. There is, so that, you know, when you do a rational assessment of what they are going to do in a given situation, if you're thinking in terms of, well, I would do this, so they're likely to do that. No, I would do this because I value human lives. They won't do that because they don't value human lives. So there's no reason to invade Poland, to subjugate the post-Soviet countries and destroy NATO. Breaking NATO is best done by discrediting the Article 5 collective defence clause that lies at its heart and which gives Europe's small nations the confidence to defy diktats and demands from Moscow. Ready or not, US, British, French, German, Italian and other forces would all have to get to the Eastern Front across a spider's web of bottlenecks, national transit license requirements and inadequate infrastructure. This is fascinating. This is something NATO's been working on. I reported on this, I don't know when it was, a year ago, 2 years ago. NATO were worrying and doing investigations and reports on how you actually get, you know, it's one thing to say Article 5, right, will come to Poland's assistance if they are invaded. It's another thing to say, well, okay, how do we get all the troops from this area in the UK and this area in France to all the way through Europe over to Poland, to the eastern borders of Poland? Well, can our tanks drive across these roads? No. Can it get across that bridge? No, they can't. How do we get railway? How do we get all the stuff from that base over there on railway all the way to Poland? You know, these things take an awful lot of planning. And are those plans in place? Unlike Ukraine, whose long logistical tail is strung across countries at peace to the west and is therefore protected, NATO's would be attacked from the outset. Every European port, warehouse, factory and railway siding involved in the war's supply chain would become a legitimate target of Russian missile strikes. And there is now a stronger consensus within Europe on the issue of whether Putin should be stopped in Ukraine. Money's being made available to rearm. Yet the clock is ticking. Europe's still moving at a peacetime's too bureaucratic pace, while the US has been kicking into reverse. Both need to change. Fascinating article, that. A quote from the Black Sea Security Forum from Ben Wallace, the former UK Defence Secretary under the last Conservative government. Actually, he was the one before Grant Shapps. Olaf Scholz has consistently played along with Putin, failing to keep his promises to Ukraine. The new Chancellor Merz wants to change that. Now, he's much more likely politically aligned with Merz, coming from a conservative background, Ben Wallace. But I think there is this idea that Scholz really wasn't strong enough against Russia, and Merz is hit the ground running in terms of rhetoric, positioning, and whatnot. And indeed, there's also been some comment on Merz having good chemistry with Zelenskyy in a way that Olaf Scholz didn't. So there's this, like, you know, when he gave him his basically gave him his business card, or basically said, "You got my number, phone me if you ever need any help," type thing. And that was caught on camera, him saying that to Zelenskyy. And when Zelenskyy was, you know, getting all huggy with Macron and Starmer, and you had Merz there as well, involved in that. And then there was this, I didn't show you this video, but it's really interesting, you know, watching Merz make Zelenskyy a cup of coffee, asking, you know, sugar, milk and all that. To put it diplomatically, I haven't often experienced such a trusting and sympathetic atmosphere as the one between Zelenskyy and Chancellor Merz. We're experiencing a new tone. This is crucial for everything else. And that comes from Alexei Makiev, the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany. So these are really good signs. It's, like I say, you concentrate on the little things, they give you a window into the bigger things. So the way that these guys hug, touch, talk, interact, make each other a cup of coffee, will tell you that here's someone that feels for, empathizes with, sympathizes for the other person, and it represents a willingness to want to work with and help out that other person, that other nation. These are really important indicators, in my opinion. Right. An American law firm was paid millions by Kremlin insiders to stop US sanctions. So this is an investigation. I don't know where it's going to be. But anyway, this is Katie Livingston, who is a freelance US journalist in Ukraine. So an American law firm was paid millions by Kremlin insiders to stop US sanctions. Two top leaders in Russia's defense conglomerate Rostec, which fuels the country's war efforts globally, hired the Washington law firm earlier this year. Both men are sanctioned for supporting the Kremlin's military and political campaigns in Ukraine, but can legally contract the services of an American law firm due to a loophole that experts say crosses into a legal grey zone. Rathmel Short LLP signed the $2.6 million contract in March to help the two oligarchs navigate US sanctions law, including preparing delisting requests and interacting with US agencies like the State Department and Office for Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. The contract also permits coordination with an American lobbying firm to support the desanctioning effort, another controversial layer of what's legally permitted. So there's work from inside the US, people being paid money to try and lobby against and find loopholes around these regulations that have been put in place and sanctions, which are already struggling to be implemented and enforced because the American administration isn't at all interested anymore. OFAC rules technically allow sanctioned individuals to seek legal help to challenge their designation, but this case involving key Putin allies, a multi-million-dollar fee, and lobbying work in the legal margins shows how some of the Kremlin's most connected figures still find backdoors into American systems of law and influence, even as the US president warns Putin he is playing with fire, a line that rings hollow while sanctioned oligarchs continue to buy access to the halls of power. How far can that reach go, and who's really keeping track? Exclusive story coming ASAP, she says. And then a little bit later, the full story, the Washington law firm, so it's in the Kiev Post now, Rathmel Short LLP agreed to represent Sergei Chermezov and Vasily Bovko, both senior leaders of Rostec, Russia's state-owned military-industrial conglomerate, in March. They paid almost $3 million for desanctioning services. Legal, but definitely questionable. So interesting, if depressing stuff there. Russians are no longer welcome in Moldova. I don't know what the backstory to this is, but 200 Russian passengers were denied entry at the airport in Moldova. I presume in Chisinau, that's not how you pronounce it. And things got a little bit heated. I hope that Moldova is standing up to Russia more and more. I'd like to know what the background to that was. Now, while the US withdraws from the world stage, says Jay in Kiev, Russia is rapidly taking over key strategic positions and resources all over Africa. So Geo Insider here says, according to recent reports by the Italian news agency Agenzia Nova, Russia is advancing plans to establish a significant military presence in southern Libya, specifically in the Sebha military base. This location, just 1,000 kilometers from Europe's southern shores, is set to become a key strategic point with the planned development of medium and long-range missiles. Massive problem, right? Syria, kicked out of Syria, go to Libya. And that is what appears to have happened. Agenzia Nova's sources indicate that Belarus is also playing a supporting role, acting as an intermediary between Russia and Libyan National Army leader General Khalifa Haftar, who recently met with Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. The Russian military build-up includes the deployment of the Tor air defense systems already in use by Haftar's forces, designed to counter drones, aircraft and missiles. Additionally, investigative data reveals that Russia has established approximately 10 military bases across eastern Libya and at least 2,000 personnel, including mercenaries and advisors, actively present in the region. So this whole worried about NATO, isn't it? It's really bad that they're doing this eastward expansion, NATO. Meanwhile, Russia is expanding in Africa to the southern shores of Europe, on the other side of the Mediterranean. No one bats an eyelid. MAGA America is still banging on about NATO and regurgitating Russian talking points. But this, it's just an absolute shocker. So Additionally, investigative data reveals that Russia has established approximately 10 military bases across eastern Libya, with at least 2,000 personnel, including mercenaries and advisors, actively present in the region. And of course, this is opposite, Italy. That's why Italy are involved. We will continue to monitor and update as more information becomes available. This is a problem. My goodness. Then, not particularly apropos to anything, but I just thought I'd share this with you. BBC obtained a smuggled North Korean phone. The phone autocorrects key Korean terms. So if you start saying something a bit dodgy, it'll autocorrect it. And secretly screenshots the screen every 5 minutes. Wow.
We've got hold of this phone that was smuggled out of North Korea last year, and it shows some of the surprising lengths the regime is now going to censor information. North Korea blocks information from outside the country, and these phones don't have access to the internet. But South Korean TV shows are being smuggled over the border to try to show North Koreans how rich South Korea is and how much freedom people have here, to try to undermine the regime. Now, Kim Jong-un has banned these shows, and from this phone you can see that he's now also blocking people from using popular South Korean words. Look what happens when I type in the word oppa. This word literally means older brother in Korean, but people here in South Korea now use it as slang to refer to their boyfriends as well.
오빠라고요, 오빠가.
When I enter it, it automatically changes to the word comrade, and I get this warning. It says this word can only be used to describe your siblings. Now look what happens if I type in the word for South Korea, which is Namhan. It automatically changes it to puppet state, which is what the North calls the South. In this folder, we can see that the phone is taking a screenshot every 5 minutes or so, but the user can't open these files, only the authorities can, so they can see when people are looking at or sharing things that they're not supposed to.
Absolutely fascinating. That is your police state big brother looking at everything you do. It's frightening. But how far away are we from that with Peter Thiel's Palantir, which is wanting a file on everyone in the United States and is getting contracts with the NHS in the UK and with every Tom, Dick and Harry. Incredible. I've done an update on the political situation in the Netherlands with the collapse of the government there as Geert Wilders has pulled out. Go and check that out, please. And then just a couple of things to... I'm going to leave you with a bit of British politics. I've been really disappointed with Reform UK recently. I know you can imagine that from my political leanings, but they have been trying to import Doge into the councils that are running now, literally, like they're calling it, British Doge, and they are using people who are woefully unqualified to try and go into these councils and root out fraud and waste. But of course, it's just the nightmare it was in the US waiting to happen in the UK. And I think it's horrible that Reform are just trying to be MAGA. They are just trying to be MAGA. But if you are under any illusion about who Reform really are, they don't give one toss about, patriotism and national security in the way that you think they might. It's all fake as far as I'm concerned. It's all like, what was it? Eddie Marsan, the actor, was recently interviewed by the newsagents, and he said, this idea of fake patriotism is all about flags and stuff, and you wave a flag and that means you're patriotic. You can't eat a flag. You can't eat a flag. Now, it's not helping your people to on the poverty line and stuff like this. There are different ways of doing patriotism. There's different ways of looking after your country, and just wrapping yourself in flags and shouting jingoistic stuff isn't that's a real veneer thin form of patriotism. And I think that's kind of what Reform is. That's how I see them. Now, Keir Starmer here says, I know where I stand on Ukraine. I stand with Ukraine against the aggressor, which is Russia. Farage and his party have got a pro-Russian foreign policy. You couldn't have a starker distinction between us. And do you know what? Good on you for saying that. In fact, I'm going to let him say that, and then I'm going to leave you with one extra thing that kind of goes to what I'm talking about.
The second thing, Nick, and it's relevant to where we started in this interview, I know where I stand on Ukraine. I stand with Ukraine against the aggressor, which is Russia. Farage and his party have got a pro-Russia foreign policy. You couldn't have a starker distinction between us. And
there's a real, you don't often hear too much of this from Starmer. He's quite calm and monotonous, but actually you could feel like there was a bit of visceral anger there. And then you have this, and not for the first time we've seen stuff like this. So not a single Reform MP could be bothered to turn up to the Strategic Defence Review Statement. Now you have James Cartledge, the Conservative shadow Defence Secretary, wearing a lapel pin with the Union flag and the Ukrainian flag. You had someone sitting behind him. I think you can see them. It might be here, James Cartledge, where he's one of these. Anyway, you had Conservatives proudly, wearing their UK lapel pins, supporting Ukraine. This is a defence review. This is working out who the enemies are in the world and what we're going to do about it. This is where you go and debate the crap out of it in Parliament. And none of the Reform MPs bothered to turn up. Not one of them. So, yay, look at me. I have a flag flying outside my house. Okay, brilliant. But what you're backing it up with, mate? Yeah, you can say strong things about immigration, but are you serious on anything else in government? Are you serious about the national security of our country? Are you aware of the challenge that Russia is? No, you appear to want to appease them as much as possible. Until you realise that public sentiment against Russia is not aligned with you, so you try and say things, a little bit different. But mate, be under no illusion that Nigel Farage is Donald Trump in British form, and so he will be anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia if he's given the slightest opportunity to be so. He has been on RT before, Russia Today. That is who Nigel Farage is. He's not a friend of Ukraine. He's not naturally a friend of Ukraine. He's naturally a friend of Russia, and we've seen that previously. Yet again, at another key moment, none of the Reform MPs could be bothered to turn up to discuss important matters in Parliament. And I think it's a disgrace. But you know my views. Take care, guys. I know it's been a long one, but there's an awful lot to go through today. But I think hopefully it's been worthwhile. There's a lot happening in the world. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.